record, and off we go. So hopefully you can all see that. I'm sure you'll yell if you can't. So we're talking today about installing GNU Linux, and we're focusing on desktop only, which is probably by far the most common options. Now the thing about this talk is we're going to do demos, and if you're doing demos of anything to do installing, there's going to be lots of gaps, lots of waiting for things to happen. So during those gaps, while we see things on the screen ticking away, feel free to use those times to, raise questions or, if you're experienced in this area, then add some additional points or whatever you need to say. So you don't need to stay silent watching the paint dry, as it were. Okay. So So this is the agenda for today. A quick look at why and perhaps why not you might want to install Linux. Now this talk is only focused on installation. And in fact, the reason I put this talk together is the Third Age Trust have got a new Linux online group, and they asked me to present an installation talk. So I'm purely focused on installation. By all means, raise issues to the group about, applications and whatnot. But the goal of today is only installation. We're going to look at, what the heck is this Linux thing? Hardware, demo, and in the demo we're going to spend most of our time. That's the whole point. And there's a couple of special cases at the end. So launching straight in. So why would you want to install Linux? Well, one of the reasons is you want to run a Linux application which is not available on Windows. This, I think, is number one reason for U3A members, and that is Windows 10 is now end of life on your hardware, and you may not be able to upgrade to Windows 11 because your hardware is not supported. So do you throw away your hardware and buy some new hardware that does support Windows 11? Or do you think, well, actually, I want to be a bit more environmental. I want to keep my perfectly good hardware and see if I can install an alternative operating system on that hardware to keep it running. Of course, the Linux is a whole part of a big open source worldwide community. So, you've got access to the source code, you can have a look at it, you can customize it. Running Linux is like being unshackled from your operating system. Once you get to use these more open tools, you realize how tightly constrained you are if you're stuck on Windows. Improve security and privacy. There's no pop-up ads or tracking. No fees. Linux is free, as in free beer. You can download it and install it, absolutely no cost. And it's also free, as in open. Good community support. So if you do get, I'll mention something on here. So if you do get issues with Linux, or in fact any open source application, you have to kind of approach the community carefully. There's no point posting on a forum, it's broken, it doesn't work. You have to do a little bit of research yourself, trying to find some error messages, some screenshots perhaps, and then post a much more detailed description. I was doing this, and this, and it didn't work. I got this error message, and the screen looked like this. Try and give your friends on the community quite a bit to get their teeth into before they start trying to help you out. That's an astonishingly wide range of software available on Linux. I would be surprised if you can't find reasonably working alternatives for the vast majority of things that you do on Windows. But there are some reasons why not. It could be that you're in too deep with Microsoft and it's just simply too hard to switch. Now, I don't think that tends to apply for individuals, but it could well apply to corporations. As soon as everyone's using Microsoft on a desktop and using Microsoft Teams to communicate and Microsoft this, Microsoft that, and then it becomes much harder to change. Having said that, you hear about governments moving completely away from Microsoft. I think there was an announcement just last week that Norway government was moving away from Microsoft to Linux on the desktop. You don't have time to learn, fair enough. If Windows is very familiar with you and Linux, you can argue it's much better, but there's a learning curve there, right? You've got to have time and effort to spend learning it. And there is some evidence, that if you're a very high-end gamer and you want to use a particular game, you may not be able to get it to run under Linux. I thought I'd mention this actually because I'm not a Windows user, but I did come across this a few years ago, and I was surprised how well it's working now. So there is this component on Windows called Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL, which is a way for you to run Linux applications inside Windows. I thought I'd just mention that if you don't want to move away from Windows, but do want to run Linux applications, this might be a way to do it. I've got a little screenshot here, and it's just one of these Windows features tick boxes. And when you start it, you can run text, command line Linux applications and graphical applications as well. So I'm not going to do anything more apart from mention that that exists. So the big thing is, what is this GNU Linux? What is its component parts? Well, obviously, we're going to install Linux on a computer of some sort, and you've got hardware. So that might be your desktop tower, it might be your laptop, it could be your little server in the corner, but you're going to have some hardware. And in that hardware, you got CPU, central processing units, you might have a graphical processing unit, you might have some, you will have some disk, USB devices, and so on. So I'll mention this in the next slide, but I think it's fairly important if you're going to jump to Linux, you actually understand your hardware. So if you've got, let's say, an Asus laptop, then it's worth looking at your current software configuration and perhaps do some print screens of your current setup. What sort of graphics card it has, have you got, what speed are your USB devices, and so on and so forth. All these things might be of interest once you start installing Linux. So Linux itself is not the complete operating system. It's only the kernel. So the kernel's job, pretty much all operating systems have this idea of a kernel. A kernel is a program that sits between the hardware and applications. So there's no applications in the kernel at all, but the Linux will, talk to all the graphics and the disks and so on behalf of your applications. So if you want an operating system, yes, you need the Linux kernel, but you need more than that. You need some applications. And the most common set of applications is GNU programs. GNU is one of these recursive acronyms that stands for GNU is not Unix. And you can go onto the website and you can download all the tools and so on. But it's open source tools and applications, both text and graphical. So you can see why that people should really call what you install on your desktop as GNU Linux, because it consists of both GNU programs and the Linux kernel. Now, what you could do, this is all open source. So you could, if you had a mind, you could go onto the internet, you could download the source code for the Linux kernel, and you could build it locally. You could download the source code for all the GNU programs and build it locally. You could download the source code for your graphical window manager, graphical apps, and compile it locally. So all of this stuff you could build yourself. And Yeah, it has, in the early days, very early days, that was the only way to do it. But here's the thing, what's happened is that other people have done all this building and bundling and testing for you. And we now have this concept of a distribution. And a distribution is that someone else has gone away, they downloaded a Linux kernel and all the programs, they've compiled it, they test them all together, they've, put it on a USB or a CD-ROM for people to use. So we will be concentrating on installing a distribution rather than these internal components. But, you know, we will still be running the Linux kernel and all these GNU programs. And the fact that it's a distribution is just a convenience, if nothing else. Now, I saw a chat message come in. I don't have the chat window open at the moment. Was someone, perhaps someone wants to speak up if they got anything to raise? Okay, I'll carry on. So, as I said before, knowing your hardware is going to be pretty important. But having said that, installations of Windows and Linux and all the other operating systems, most hardware is usually auto-detected. So you just go ahead and install it and answer the questions and off you go. But sometimes there might be issues. So knowing your hardware is is going to be quite useful. So we're taking screenshots of your current operating system settings because when you start installing, of course, you can't see your hardware settings. So your CPU type, whether it's Intel, AMD, ARM, or whatever it might be, your memory size, your hard disk configurations, or maybe you've got multiple hard disks. If you're going to start off with Windows with all your, Microsoft Office documents on it, you probably want to back it up before you attempt to install. Even if you're going to do one of the uh, dual boot options, which I'll talk about, you kind of have to assume if you're going to install Linux on your existing machine that things can go wrong and your hard disk could be deleted. So, for God's sake, back up anything important before installing Linux. One thing to mention is in Windows really comes from, the early days of DOS. We get used to drive letters, A colon was the first floppy disk drive, B colon was the second floppy disk drive, C colon was the first hard disk, and so on, all the way up to Z colon. Um, but in Linux, we don't make use of drive letters as such. Um, so you have to get out your mind drive letters once you start using Linux. I can see a couple of questions. I'll come to those in a minute. Graphics types and versions. Now, the chances are when you're installing Linux, you'll get graphics working, but you may not get all the features of the graphics cards working. So that's where you might need to know the detailed model number of your graphics card. You might need to do some research, maybe do some little configurations on that. Well, I've got some questions in the window. John's put the other wise slowness of Windows on old hardware, dislike of AI Copilot in Windows. Yep. Alan was asking, is there just one Linux kernel? There is only one source code to a Linux kernel, but when you build the kernel, you can configure which components you include in the kernel. So for example, you might have a Linux kernel which is built particularly for newer hardware, and the older hardware support is now no longer in that binary. So there's only one set of source code, but people will build it in different ways depending on the distribution and the way it's going to be deployed. Need to understand a little bit about the boot process. So when a desktop PC, you turn it on, press the power button, and the first thing that happens is that the basic input output system or BIOS, or more modern machines, the extendable firmware interface is called, and these are burnt into your hardware. They're hard coded. They start running as soon as you turn the power on, and you'll see some BIOS type messages start on the screen. What happens then? The BIOS will search for bootable disks, and it will search for them in a particular order. Now, the default order is usually sufficient for our installation needs. The default order is usually something like CD-ROM, USB devices, and then hard disks, or even boot over the network. Now, that's important because what we're going to do is we're going to create a installation on a USB stick. We're going to plug it into our Windows machine, start it on, start the machine up, and we should have that USB take priority over the Windows installation on the hard disk drive. If you unplug the USB stick, then what's on the hard disk becomes the first boot order in list. Now, if the boot order isn't correct, you can usually go into BIOS settings and mess around with the boot order. But when you're installing, you need to make sure that the USB, what you're installing from, has a higher priority than your hard disk drives. So what happens is when the BIOS finds the first device that's got a master boot record, it will start executing that. And then the master boot record will load a bootloader. And the bootloader is specific for each operating system. So on Linux, we've got Grub or Grub 2. On Windows, we've got Boot Manager. On Embedded, we've got U-Boot and so on. So we've got a bootloader running. And when the bootloader runs, it starts loading the first program, which is going to be the system kernel from disk, and starts the kernel. And then the Linux kernel will then start running what's called an init system to start processes, which is going to be things like, keyboard managers and network devices and all the rest of it. So there's a sequence of boot processes that the BIOS manages, looks for the first bootable disk. The master boot record is run, and then the bootloader is run. And the bootloader may present you with a menu, and then the kernel is run, and the kernel is started, and the kernel then runs all the separate processes. Now, as we go through the demo, I'll try and point these things out as they happen. So there we are. So installation demo, we're getting there, honest. So first thing to do is to read the instructions. I would say so. And I should have put that in twice. Once you've read the instructions, read them again, just to make sure you really have understood it. Now, I'm going to do a demo here, so I actually don't have a physical Windows machine. So for demo purposes, I've got Windows running in a virtual machine. So I'm going to install Linux on the virtual, and that doesn't matter much, except for it's probably a little bit slower than a real installation works. But there we go. So first thing, the installation instructions are going to tell you is to download your install image, and then we burn that to the USB. We'll go through and you actually see this process in action. And then we'll restart the computer, which means that the USB is now a bootable device. So we boot off from the USB, and then the USB goes through all the installation choices. Then once Linux is installed on your hard disk, we do a shutdown, unplug the USB stick, start up, and now the main drive has Linux installed on it. And of course, then we just boot from the hard disk under Linux. So this is the installations for Ubuntu, and honestly, read through it. But they tend to be very chatty installations. It tells you what you'll need, flash drive and so on. And it tells you to download an image, and gives you links where to download it from, create a bootable USB stick, and so on and so forth. So it does take you through it quite nicely. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just share my Magic Windows machine. And honestly, do interrupt me if there's anything you want to mention. I'm not always watching the chat window here. So hopefully you can see that. This is my Windows server. I think this is actually Windows 11. So I'm kind of assuming you're starting from Windows, and at least for the first demo, the scenario is you're going to completely delete Windows and install Linux on in its place. So you can see I've already downloaded the disk image file. I've gone onto the website and clicked here to download the image. And there are lots of tools you can use to take that image and burn it to the USB stick. If you're using Linux to do this process or even a Mac, you'd probably just use the command line tool called DD, which is, I don't know, 30 years old or something. If you're using Windows, you might be using what I'm using here as Rufus. There's another common one, which is Banal Etcher. But there's lots of tools. They all do the same thing. They take this image and burn it to disk. So I'll talk through, let's start up Rufus. Okay, so this is Rufus, and the purpose of this application is to take this image and write it out to our USB stick. Now, of course, it's possible that you write your image to the wrong drive letter in Windows. So you could, you've got a device here at the top. You could, in theory, select C colon and completely destroy your Windows. However, these tools will pretty much always have safeguards. So, for example, Rufus will actually even list it. It only lists on our USB drive, which is D colon. And one trick to look for is just check the size. So if you find you're going to write your image to a 2 terabyte USB stick, that's a bit of a warning flag. No, I've selected the wrong one here. But anyway, all we need to do is to select the file that we've downloaded, which I've downloaded to the desktop here. And this is our image here. And it's populated. And then I'm just going to take everything else as default. So I'm just going to start here. It gives you some warnings. I'm just going to go for the details. And there we are. We see some progress here, and we can see the USB stick as it's slowly being written out. So any comments or questions so far? Because this is the first paint drying.
And any thoughts on different types of Linux distributions? I mean, I gather Linux Mint would be a good alternative to Windows for most people.
Yeah, I've heard people say that a lot. Bear in mind that all these distributions are going to consist of a Linux kernel, GNU utilities, window manager, and graphical applications. So they're not hugely different. But on Linux Mint, the defaults are usually a bit more user friendly than, say, Debian. So yeah, absolutely. Linux Mint is very popular for, let's say, beginners or first Linux. So now a little bit later, I might actually show it here, but there is couple of special installation modes. One of them is called a live CD, which means you can take a USB stick, you can burn an image on it, boot up with it, and without touching what you've got installed on your C colon, you can actually try Linux out and play around with it, see if you like it. So you could take the view of, I'm going to try several different distributions, see if I like the look and feel, choose one before actually installing it.
In that situation, if you actually save something, would it actually save it to the USB stick, or would all your
Yes,
creation
they
lost?
they depends on the live CD, but yes, you can save information. They usually have a special file system which they load into memory, which is like a layer type file system. I won't go into it now, which you can edit a document and save it and so on. Try printing or whatever is important to you before you start.
And when you shut down, the USB stick carries that information with it. Does it?
Check on the particular form of the live installer.
Okay.
Some will do that, some will not. Okay, so that's finished writing the USB stick. I think have a look at it if you like. Windows Manager, we've now got our USB stick. It's got a name, Ubuntu, and it's got lots of files on it. And in there somewhere is going to be the kernel and some lots of tools and such like. So we've got our USB stick physically plugged into our machine now. So all I need to do is to do a reboot, and then the BIOS will look, the USB stick is now the first bootable devices. So there it will start booting from the USB stick. I'll just do a restart. Hopefully we're not going to get a prompt for installing updates as we do a shutdown on Windows.
What virtual system are you using here, out of interest?
This is UTM running on my MacBook.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Oh, sorry, John, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. I don't think it's a good idea. I prefer this, show the hand business, if you don't mind. I've been using Ubuntu for about 15 years or so, and I found by hard experience, always use what's called the long-term support version. So that comes out in April every 2 years. So the last one was 2024. So I would not use 25.04, which you're installing. This seems to give more problems than it's worth. And the 2 year long-term support versions are supported for 5 years. So you get security updates for 5 years. And they updates a certain amount of the software, the application software. I haven't really found a problem with it. I run Ubuntu on an AMD computer. This one's 16 gigabytes. The minimum I've found for standard Ubuntu nowadays I'd recommend is 8 gigabytes. And I'm running it on an 8 gigabyte Raspberry Pi without any problems. And if you're going to go under 8 gigabytes, it's difficult to know, but there's variants of Ubuntu, and one of the standard ones a lot of people like is Ubuntu Mate, which runs fine on 4 gigabytes, or perhaps even less. I haven't tried it on less. Um, Other points are I would not use Linux Mint because basically it's taking Ubuntu and it's putting an extra layer on top, which I think gives you more issues in my opinion, than it's worth. And I've never really found any problem at all with standard Ubuntu. And I run 4 at home, and I probably support friends who have installed Ubuntu, particularly on old desktops. Probably about half a dozen, 7. I can't remember. And very, very rarely do I get queries. So I haven't really found any problem on drivers, except I think a few years ago was a problem on some Broadcom wireless driver, but generally none. Yes, and generally speaking, I stick with the applications that Ubuntu installs, with one or two exceptions. So I prefer, for instance, VLC to Rhythmbox, which is what Ubuntu wants to install, or rather Canonical, the company that does it. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself there. Okay.
Yeah, just as you're talking there, John, thanks for that. That's good
Mm.
input. Ubuntu 24.02.2 is the current long-term support version on Intel.
4.2. They come out in April, but generally I don't upgrade till about October to the teething
Yeah,
problems. Around about 6 months
yeah.
is be fine. But I wouldn't do it straight away in general terms. Mm.
Alan.
Yeah, I don't want to be too controversial, but I would like to defend Linux Mint. If you look at the Linux distributions, there are lots and lots of them. My advice would be and they've got different attributes, and some will suit some people and some will suit others. My recommendation would be, because I've tried lots of them, my recommendation would be try as many as you possibly can. look at things like YouTube to see what attributes each of them have got, and then make a decision. But there's also something else, and it's this. Once you've decided on a distribution, you probably really want to stick with it for some time to keep switching every 2 or 3 months to move to the latest version or the latest bright star in terms of distributions probably would not be a good idea. So do your research, find out a distribution that suits you, and then stick with it for 12 months at least, I would say.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, whilst John was talking, we went a bit further in the demo than I wanted to. So I'm going to just restart and go back to where we were. Restart this. Yeah, restart. I want you to restart now. I wanted to talk through the actual little boot up process here. And of course, it timed out and went on. So actually what I'm going to do, I'm just going to power it off, start it again. Right, so this is the BIOS starting on our virtual machine, and your mesh will be different. Now it's gone straight into the Grub bootloader, which is loaded from the USB device. And what Grub allows actually is some interaction. So we can actually, go and choose options here. And you can see here the first option is try or install Ubuntu. So at the moment, we've not written anything to our hard disk. We're simply booting off the USB stick. I'll select the top option. It'll be a repeat of what you saw just now, but I just wanted to talk through the startup messages. So what's happening now is the Linux kernel is being loaded. It's now loaded. The Linux kernel is starting up the init process, and we see all the system services starting here. This stuff is not generally important unless you've got problems, but it's nice to see something starting up. And these are all little services that, an operating system needs running just for anything to work, printing, networking, and all the rest of it. The installation scripts will start, will flip into a graphical mode, and we'll go into the installer. So the installer itself is actually a Linux operating system. So we'll get this installed. John, you still got your hand up. And you're muted. I don't know if you're, oh, put your hand down. Okay, so, and here we are installing, the installer started, we're booting from the USB stick. So far, nothing has happened to your hard disk. And you'll get lots of, fairly nice chatty questions. What language? Well, we're going to choose English. Accessibility, no, we're okay. We don't need any of that. Keyboard type, English UK. Got a little place here to test your keyboard if you have to. And connect to the internet. So the installation, although there's some programs on the USB stick which is going to be copied to your hard disk, a lot of it's going to be downloaded from the internet. Now, what you can do, you don't have to download the internet from the internet. You can get bigger images that has everything on there. So, corporations will do this. They really don't want everyone just arbitrarily downloading stuff from the internet. So you can get all the applications on your either big USB stick or CD-ROM. But in this particular installer is fairly small, so it's going to download a lot of stuff from the internet. So we're going to allow it to use a wired. And here you can see it. You can install it or you can try it. This particular installer has got both the try, which is often called a live CD, or install. We're going to go install it. Interactive. These installers can be automated, which corporations will use. You'll create a little tiny file, add it to your installer so you can do a completely automated installer on hundreds of machines at the same time. We're going to be interactive. In this case, we got like a default selection of applications or extended selections. Well, yeah, we'll go for the extended selection. And Install proprietary software. Now, I've not seen this used for years and years and years, but certainly way back, you used to get hardware which was not supported directly by the Linux kernel, which means you couldn't even write to the hard disk or display. And what would happen is the hardware supplier would provide a little device driver for that hardware. And so this is a point where you could load that software in from the hardware manufacturer so the installer could actually write to the hard disk. But say I've not actually seen it used for a long time now. And how do you want to install Ubuntu? So I'm going to go for this option for the moment. Erase a disk. So I'm going to completely zap Windows and install Ubuntu on the hard disk. I don't want to do encryption. Thank you very much. You'll need to create a first account. Always use the same one. And there we are. And in fact, you've got a little tick box here. If it's your personal machine, you may not want to require a login, but I will for this time. Time zone for, date settings. Yep, it's got us right. And there we are. So up until now, we've not actually written anything to the disk. And this is a point where you review all your settings, you read through that. And if I click install on here, which I will do, now we've deleted the hard disk. Windows now will no longer boot. We've actually started writing to there. If I just simply at that point, before I clicked install, turn the machine off and on again, unplug the USB stick, Windows would still boot up. I haven't touched it. So now this is the installation process, which takes, I think, about 7 or 8 minutes, that sort of time. And what it's doing, as well as providing some pretty pictures, is it's writing Linux kernel and all your tools and applications to your hard disk, which used to contain Windows. Now, usually on these installers, there's a little click box here you can click, which actually shows you what's happening from a text window point of view. Now, this is important because if the installation doesn't work for some reason, maybe it doesn't recognize your hardware or can't make decisions, you might want to copy and paste that information to share it on a forum or go back to Ubuntu and raise an issue. Ray.
Yeah, I noticed there's what looks like a pause button there on the bottom left.
Yeah. Do you want me to press it?
Can you tell me what happens? It just pauses the installation or what?
I've no idea.
Oh, right.
No idea. I've never pressed it. Maybe if we do it again, the installation again, I'll press it then to see. There's also a forward back. It might be just the pause of. Oh, it's just the screens. We're not pausing the installation. We're just.
Oh, I see.
We're just
right.
a little slideshow there. So, any other points? I like the idea to put your hand up rather than just talking to avoid conflict. So, the hard disk. If this was a physical machine, the hard disk light would be spinning away, chattering away. David.
Yeah, a couple of points from my experience using Linux. Anyway, the first one is if you are going to want to experiment with different kernels, what I would recommend is install Ubuntu first and then learn how to use KVM, which is a virtual machine environment, and then use that, and you can try out any other installations. But it's a lot less complicated process than having to, if you like, burn a USB all the time. The other approach would be, instead of creating like a Ubuntu live CD on USB, is to put Ventoy on it. And Ventoy, it boots up, but it's sort of like a meta bootloader. What you can do is with that USB, you just copy image files to it, and then it offers those up as separate menu items when it boots. So you could have 4 or 5 distros on there, and then you can delete one, replace it with another, and that new item will come up in the menu as well. So that's the way I tend to do it. The other thing I observed, where you were talking about whether you require the login as part of creating your account, it's always a good idea to require the login. One of the early issues I had was when I was trying to use I was running Windows as my main machine, and I installed Ubuntu on another PC, and I tried to use remote Windows onto the Linux. It wouldn't let me do that because the Linux machine, when it booted up, it automatically went into my user and started the GUI, and so there was a conflict of GUIs. If you require a login every time, then you tend to have less problems with remote window apps. Yeah, so that's it so far.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I have used that that tool that you mentioned with lots of images in a corporate environment. Yeah, where you just, an IT, you have one stick that does everyone. You can walk around people's desks and choose the right one. James.
Yeah, I just wondered if there's a registry in Linux systems like there is in Windows.
No. So in Linux, there is a thing called the standard Unix layout, and the way Unix works, and Linux is a type of Unix. Unix is a standard. You can go and download the standard. And one of the principles of the Unix is, I'm going to mute him. One of the principles is that everything is available on the file system. So there's no C colon and D colon. Everything is mounted from a root file system slash. So configurations of things like processes, your network stuff, there's a standard location to put that configuration, and it's in the slash etc directory. Logs, for example, go into slash var slash log and so forth. So there's a standard place to have home directories and configurations. There is no need for anything like a registry. So how are we doing? It's still chugging along. I told you it's going to be waiting, like watching paint dry. And to think we might choose to go through this a second time. Any other points to raise while this is chugging away? David, again. You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if it's still true. There tend to be fewer problems if you're using AMD graphics cards than if you're using NVIDIA. Certainly NVIDIA was proprietary drivers before, whereas I've never had a problem installing on AMD. It's never needed proprietary drivers to use that. Now that situation might have changed. I don't know. I haven't used NVIDIA for about 4 years now.
Yeah, good point. Paul.
Yeah, I may have missed it, Peter, because I was driving earlier. But running it on a memory stick in a kind of standalone mode, if you're using a Mac, and you'd obviously use an older Mac, not an M series, because they're still quite new, is there not something that Apple bound in at one point with Secure Boot that you had to do some quite extensive hacking of the bootloader to be able to load anything other than macOS?
This is, Max uses EFI boot. I do remember this because EFI was locked down with various cryptography and such like. I believe that is an old issue now, just from memory. I've not actually had to do that myself, but I seem to remember lots of reports saying that's no longer an issue.
Right, because they used to support Boot Camp, didn't they, and Parallels, and I'm not sure Parallels is supported anymore, particularly on the M series stuff, because it's quite tied into the T2 chip, isn't it, with all the security for good reasons, but then it takes some flexibility away. But I'm assuming that on all Windows boxes, it isn't a problem, and you can put quite a lightweight version of Unix on those and get some good results from it.
Yes.
Yep, thanks.
Alan again.
Yeah, just you've gone for the option of completely overwriting your Windows system here.
Yep.
But the other options were to have both systems running at the same time, Windows and Linux. And
Yes.
if you go for that option, you get a choice of either doing it on running the systems on the same disk or on separate disks.
Yeah, let me
just
let me
make
just
some
let me
comments
just
on
stop
that.
you there because we are going to demonstrate that.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth, as you say,
Absolutely.
explaining that. So thanks.
Okay, I'll come to David in just a second because our installation is now completed. So one thing I always notice is that installing Linux is like just a one-shot process. There's no reboots. Whenever I come to install Windows, I find it incredibly slow, about 10 reboots and such like. Anyway, so the write into the hard disk is now complete. So what we're going to do now is just to follow its prompt to restart it. Now, what's happening now is the Linux kernel that was loaded from the USB stick is now shutting down, stopping all the processes. Now, what we're looking for is a message down the bottom telling us that we are now safe to eject the USB stick. So we're just waiting for that. Now, it's generally better to allow Linux to shut down itself because then it's going to finish writing everything to the disks. Although, file systems these days are quite tolerant about turning things off, particularly doing installation. You want to make sure everything's really flush to the disk.
Peter, will you share your screen, please?
Yeah, I am sharing my screen. Can you not see it?
No?
Is that true for everyone?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I can see it. I can see it.
You see it?
I can see it.
Yeah.
So it's a problem with you, Tommy. Maybe check to see if you've got it covered over.
I don't know if people realize, but on this Zoom workplace, you get tabs now.
Yeah.
You have to make sure you get the tab selected for Peter's screen.
Oh, yes. Yes, my fault.
Right. So I messed that up. But what I've done now is I've ejected the USB stick. And now the computer is booting up itself. So now it should load what we've just installed from the hard disk.
Yeah, I see it.
And we can see Linux starting up here. This is all this is all from the hard disk. We can see all network. You see IPv6 has started there. I noticed there. Network services, printing, so on and so forth. And we flip to a graphics mode and we can log in. And so there we go. This is our first installation of Linux. It gets you a little welcome, for the first time. And I'm not going to give a demonstration, but we've got a web browser, Firefox installed there. We've got Office tools installed. So we've got lots of things already installed, and of course you can go in and install anything you like. But this today is not about Linux itself. We're going to focus on the installation. So that's our first install. Now I'm just going to brutally turn that virtual machine off. And I'm going to go back to our slides. So that was our first installation. This Zoom keeps driving me nuts. So there are some special cases, and we've already talked about it in the chat, really. There is a form of USB or CD-ROM used to be called a live CD. I believe now people tend to call it Try Linux instead, but it's the same thing. You boot from a USB stick and you stay with the Linux that's on that USB stick. So it's a good way to try Linux before committing to it. So sometimes it's a separate image you have to burn to a USB, and sometimes it's part of the main install. And I will do this in a minute. So I think you saw it. If you clicked on Try Ubuntu, then basically the installer stops, and you can use Linux as it was loaded from the USB stick. And another case which we started to talk about, and I just called a stop with it because I will do that as a second demo. Now there is this option of what's called dual boot. So instead of completely overriding Windows, what you can do, you can resize Windows, or if you've got 2 disks, you've got more options, but keep Windows on your hard disk and install Linux separately. And it's sometimes called a dual boot or alongside. So partition your disk into 2. Part of it's going to have Linux on and part of it's going to have Windows. And when you turn on, once you've got that installation, you can select which one to boot. Personally, I hate this because I think you may as well make the full jump and actually start using Office tools and such like under Linux rather than going back to Windows. But sometimes it's useful to have a gentle step to Linux before taking the full feet forwards. And when you turn such a machine on, and we'll try this, right? We've got the Grub boot manager, and you can see here we've got the option of Ubuntu, or we've got an option of Windows, so we can choose which operating system to boot. Right, so I am going to go back to our installer. So what I'm going to do now, behind your back, is go to my my virtual machine manager. I'm going to delete the virtual machine I've just created. I'm going to create a brand new one. And I'm going to remove, I'm going to delete the USB stick, because otherwise we're not starting. And basically what I'm doing now is starting from where we joined the meeting. So let me reshare this. So this is Windows booting up now prior to any Linux installation. So we're just starting again. Windows, log in, and again we're going to do exactly what we did before. We're going to use Rufus to burn the USB stick. We're going to select the image. Here it is from the desktop. And off we go again. So any questions or any points to raise while that's running for the second time? I told you there'd be lots of gaps in today's demo while we watch the screen. David.
Yeah, so going back to on the booting, sometimes it can get confusing because if you try booting with secure boot on, some Linux distros will work and some won't. So the only one that's, I believe, officially recognized for the secure boot is Ubuntu. And what can happen is you can have a distro and the live CD will boot up and run, but when you do the install and then try and install, it won't run because of the secure boot. So what I tend to do is turn secure boot off. A specific example of that is Popos, which is based on Ubuntu, whereas Ubuntu will happily boot up and install irrespective of how secure, if secure boot is on or off. Popos won't. It will boot and install, but then won't run. Right, if secure boot's on, and it just gets horribly messy. So the thing I took away from that was if you're going to start, then start with Ubuntu. And then when you understand how Linux things work and you've got a bit more experience, then perhaps move on to other distros. The other one would be to have a second disk and have all your data and docs on that. And so you have your OS on one disk, or maybe even two OSs. You could have the Windows on there as well, but always have your data stuff on a separate drive.
Yep, good points as always. I've just repeated what we did at the beginning. You probably was watching. I was just what David was talking. So I've copied the Ubuntu image to USB. I booted from USB, and this is the kernel starting up. And this time we'll choose some different options for the installation, so you can see how that works. Right, okay, so this is a US boot up from the USB stick. Windows is still there on our hard disk. We've not done anything to it quite yet. All right, so we'll go through these steps as before. Select UK keyboard. Right, so this time I'm going to just try Ubuntu, why not? And so now we've got Ubuntu running. So we're just running from everything just loaded from the USB stick. And we've got web browsers. I think we've even got Office tools here. Got a lot of stuff there. But probably the main reason you want to try things out is perhaps you want to try if your microphone's working or your speaker's working, or the other bits of hardware is working, if you like the window manager where all the icons are, because there's always options with Linux. That's the thing. So you can play around with it. You can, and this is pretty decent but mini version of GNU Linux running booted from the USB stick. Now, one thing you will find is it's probably a little bit slower than if you've installed on your hard disk, because USBs tend to be, they work slightly differently. But other than that, you can actually test a lot of your features out. Ray.
Can you get Zoom on Linux?
Good question. I don't know. I believe David's laughing. I believe David's got a very full answer to that.
Sure answer, yes. I'm using it at the moment.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. And that's from Zoom US, is that? Or is it backdoor job?
No, it's standard. There's a standard. What you tend to find is with software that is not developed by the community, and is typically commercial software, is it'll be issued as what's called a snap package. And that's basically like it's running in a container. It's containerized software, so they can incorporate all the software they know they need. So it's independent of the separate various Linux installations. So they're independent of all the messiness. So I'm running Zoom, and it's been distributed as a snap. There are a couple of others. Oh, Code, VS Code, Microsoft's VS Code is also a snap.
Okay, you just mentioned a word which has been bothering me for a while, containers. I keep seeing it coming up nowadays, and I got no real feel for what they are. But never mind.
Well, the
Yeah.
short version is that it's a virtual machine environment.
Okay.
Okay, so so if you wrote an application that say ran on oh gosh, I would say I developed some software in C++ that ran on my installation. So that's the version of Linux kernel, the set of libraries I've got. If I wanted to distribute that and I just distributed the binary of the app, the chances are it wouldn't run because other users wouldn't have the same set of libraries and what have you. But if I containerize it, I include all those libraries in the package, and then they run the container
Okay.
as
Right.
long as yeah, I mean it'll run on their Linux just as well as it would run on mine.
I can see Alan's hands up, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to carry on with this installation, and then perhaps Alan, we can come to you while we've got lots of time waiting for stuff to. So this is a live CD or try before you use running it, but you see we've got a little icon there. Now we can carry on our installation if we wanted to, which we do because what we're going to do in our second demo here is to install Linux without clobbering Windows. So we're going to include an interactive installation. Let's go for default this time, why not? Don't want any third parties. And here we are, we're going to select install Ubuntu alongside other partitions. And in this case, this means Windows. So instead of deleting Windows, we're going to resize that, squish it down a bit so Windows is taking up less disk space, and we're going to install Linux in the remaining space. So this is where you really need to make sure you've got a backup. Yeah, this process usually works in my experience, but it may not. You really don't want to lose that. So we're going to install Linux alongside Windows. And here it's given us a choice to split the hard disk. In this case, we've got 42 gig for what was there before Windows and 25 gigs for Ubuntu. I'm just going to go with its calculated defaults. No encryption again. Create your account. Enter the password. I'm going to untick that just for a bit of novelty value so that when Linux boots up, we just go logged in straight away. Time zone, that's correct. Summary, install Ubuntu alongside other partitions. And it's actually given us a Microsoft partition there. And off we go. So, sorry, Alan, I was just going to get to that point to make best use of our time.
No, that's fine. Just on this container things, the idea of the container, as David quite rightly says, is that it installs the main software and all the subservient software, all the dependent software to run that particular piece of main software in one container. So when you install it, all the dependencies are installed automatically with it. The upside of that is that it always works. Yeah. The downside is that you get duplication of the dependency software, which in most cases doesn't matter. And there's another containerizer system called Flatpak, which also works extremely well. So, and again, going along with what David said, my recommendation would be as a first priority, if you want to install some software onto Linux, try and use a containerized version of the software rather than the normal software that's available, in the shop.
Okay, and presumably that any data that software then creates is saved on your normal hard disk, not within the container.
All of the data is kept separately. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's useful to know. Thank you.
Right, so this is going to take us about 8 minutes again. Any other points or questions to raise? Obviously, we've got a lot of experts here, so it's quite a productive meeting.
There's a question in the chat from Paul. Are there any workable Windows versions that are free download for legacy program compatibility?
Good point. So there is a long-running open source community which has been building up a way to run Windows application. It's called Wine, as in the drink, and it stands for Wine is not an emulator. And that has now implemented a huge amount of the Windows APIs so that quite a large number of Windows applications can be installed and run within Wine. So the process is you have Linux running, you install Wine, and then you install, Microsoft Office or whatever it might be. And there is a version of Wine called Crossover Office from Code Weavers, which I actually did a lot of work with back in the day. And they do a commercially supported version of Wine with officially licensed or not officially tested applications. And they support thousands of Windows applications, Crossover. So that's one quick response. If you're into gaming, then there is Linux is well supported. Someone's going to jump in and give me the name of the limit of the gaming system that runs on Windows and
Well,
Linux.
Steam is a
Steam,
pretty
thank
good
you. That's the
platform
one.
to use. There are others. There are about 4 or 5 different ones, but Steam has the widest coverage here. The other thing is that they are actively driving the development of Wine as well, particularly for games. The problem with Wine was always graphic-based applications. So, for example, even today, you can't run Autodesk Fusion on Wine successfully without a lot of hacking, basically. So, yeah, if you're into gaming, then Steam is definitely a platform to look at.
So I can see Alan put his hand up where David didn't. So, but just before we go to Alan, the other way to do it, of course, yeah, sorry. The other way to do it is in an emulator, of course, a virtual machine. So you can see I've been running Windows today on my MacBook. I don't have Windows natively installed. I just run Windows under emulation. So Alan, I know you've been patient. Thank you for that.
No, that's fine. Just on the distributions, we should probably make it clear that for most people there are 2 types of distribution as well as flavors. One is the Debian based stuff, which is like Debian and Ubuntu and Linux Mint, but there's also something called Arch Linux, which is quite different, and the programs for that are things like Manjaro. Again, my recommendation, and I think probably most people here would agree, hopefully, is that you start off by looking at the Debian-based systems and things like Debian, Ubuntu, and Linux Mint, rather than diving into the Arch systems right at the start.
And I'm just going to add to that because back in the day, I used a distribution an awful lot called Gen 2. And the way Gen 2 did it is when you install a package, it will build it from source. So, the idea being that it was built specifically for your CPU chipset and have all the various compiler optimizations set for your particular desktop. So yes, yes, that's a good point. Thank you for that. Paul.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look up something, but there seems to be an increasing problem now with videos and this digital rights management protection. I'm trying to find the right word for it because I've been having some problems using an old computer and stuff that I use that's just connected to the old bit of Apple TV hardware because I'm going to replace it when they bring out the new one. And it's not letting you play things because the HDMI is not compliant or the drivers aren't compliant with these new digital rights management thing. And it's not just things like Amazon and Disney Plus and stuff like that. It's starting to affect, so I'm told, people are having problems with YouTube and all sorts of things now, because they're increasingly trying to crack down on things so that you can only run it, say, from an up-to-date Windows or Mac box. And I can't see any way of getting around that, really, unless the dark community have put something out, because they seem to be trying to lock a lot of these platforms down now, even when you've got a license for it and you've paid the subscription.
Yeah, I hear your pain.
If I can find the actual words it used, because it flashes up on the screen so fast that you can't actually snap it. I'll put it in the chat box. But it is just something to watch out for, because we spent ages trying to sort the problem out and realised it was a hardware problem, not a configuration problem.
Thank you. Yes. How are we doing? Oh, there we go. Look at that. Good timing. Okay, so remember we've selected this time the option to keep Windows, but install Linux as well. So crossing my fingers a bit that this will work. Yeah, of course it'll work. What I'm doing, I'm not doubting it at all. So this is the USB stick shutting down. We've completely, written on our C drive, but we've moved Windows around to a different place. Let that shut down. I'm going to eject the USB stick so we don't just boot up with the installer again. When the USB stick kernel is completely finished shutting down. Oh, there we are. I have ejected the USB stick. Go on then. Has someone got a bird in the background?
I gotta say.
Sorry, it's me. I'm outside. I forgot to turn the mic.
Oh, right. No. I was quite enjoying it.
I thought I had hearing problems.
I can just hear traffic here, so it's quite a nice thing.
We are lucky we got lots of birds and it's quiet where I live, but I forgot to turn the mic off. Sorry about that. Tweet.
All right, so we're starting up again. This is a BIOS options booting up. So now you see we've got a different option here. We can go to Ubuntu or we can select the Windows Boot Manager. And this is Grub. There are alternative boot managers that different distributions will use. You can also vastly configure this bootloader and get graphics there and all sorts of things you can do. The basics, as you can see, is pretty dull. But tell you what, let's boot Windows first. Let's make sure that works. So now we've got a computer that can run Windows natively and Linux natively. It sounds like it's booting up okay. So this is Windows. We'll log in just to prove, and we're back to where we were. The disk space that's available to Windows is obviously a bit smaller than it was. And we'll restart just so we can select the other options to boot into Linux instead.
And this is QEMU emulator or virtual machine or whatever you call it.
Yeah, I'm using, for the purpose of the demo, because it means I can play around a lot, I'm using UTM on Mac, which is
UTM.
UTM, yes, which does use QEMU under the covers. We had a talk about this a while back, actually. So we're back to the settings here, and I can click on Ubuntu to boot Linux instead. And you can configure defaults there. So, if you don't press anything within 5 seconds, you automatically boot into Linux or whatever. And there we are. We have our dual boot system installed. Now, the thing I happen to know about this is you probably won't do this if you've got a disk encryption set on your Windows. So if you read the documentation, it'll say if you want to do a dual boot settings, then you have to go into Windows and disable encryption, which I did for this image. And there we go. I'm not going to do any more demos on this. Let's go back to the slides, and we'll round off. We're doing pretty well for time in. Right, so back to the slides. So we've done a dual boot demo. We booted into this new Zoom is driving me batty, or alongside. And I think, as someone mentioned, if you've got more than one disk, then the installer will allow you to choose which disk to keep Windows on and which disk to use for Linux. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is what we've talked about so far is desktop Linux. Now, that's not the world I work in. I tend to use Linux on my servers. And to do that, we have single board computers, like the Raspberry Pi that's already been mentioned. I happen to choose Orange Pi mostly because they got more memory and are faster. So good for low power servers, web servers and shared files, home automation, a whole bunch of things. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that the installation on those is different. Typically, what you do is you have a little tiny SD card and you go to your desktop, you take the boot image, you burn that on the SD card, and then you unplug the SD card, plug it into the single board computer and boot up, and that's your job done. So there's no boot from a media and then copy it over and go through an installer. It works slightly differently. And the distributions on these single board computers are often fairly specific for those hardware. I'm using a version of Debian on my servers called Armbian because those are customized. They've got all the different kernel configurations for ARM-based single board computers. And this is the latest single board computer that I've bought. And the reason I mention this because if you turn it over on the back, you'll see there's this little micro SD card slot. So you burn an SD on your desktop, you plug it in there, turn it on, it'll boot up. You can also plug in an eMMC card, which is very fast, much faster than SD cards, bit of disk space really. And in fact, in this particular, you've got a third option, which is an SSD drive, M2. You can plug that in and you have to follow the instructions to actually burn the installation on your M2 SSD card. In fact, that's the way I run most of my servers. I've got Linux booted from M2 SSD card and several terabytes of disk space on there. So I didn't want to go into too much on the details, just to point out that there are special cases where the installation of Linux doesn't follow the pattern that we've been looking at, but the pattern that we're looking at is indeed suitable for most desktops. And we've gone to references. So I'm going to stop sharing. I can see Ray's got his hand up already.
Again.
Again, yes.
Right. Have further questions? Two questions. You use the term burn. Is that just a question of copying the image off the USB stick onto?
Yeah, it's a terminology which is a hangover from
Burning CDs.
with CDs. So before USB drives were popular, the process was you download an image, you'd actually get some CD burning software, and you'd actually burn it to a CD and then boot from that CD. Or you'd actually, go online and actually get a CD emailed to you to save you that process. So, I tend to use the burn-in as a hangover from those days.
And it's a simple copying of an image from somewhere onto the
yes, yeah.
M2 or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. A second thing, out of curiosity, what was that single board computer you just showed?
It was an Orange Pi 5 Ultra. I've just bought one recently to try and run some AI stuff on it.
Okay, thank you.
So it's very similar to a Raspberry Pi. They are more expensive, but they
Hello, I'm zooming.
Nope. So I'll mute you. Yeah, so you have to order them on AliExpress because they're made in China. You know, they've got like 16 gigs or 32 gigs of RAM. They've got M2 slots. They're fast, multiprocessor.
What faster than a Pi 5?
Oh yeah, much faster.
Okay.
But still of the low power ilk. Right, so we're doing very well for time. I usually try to finish at 4:30, and we are pretty much at 4:30. Any other points to make? And we've got quite a knowledgeable audience on this subject, which is great. Any other questions for the group? Nothing. Silence is golden.
Sorry, just a quickie one. There's interesting stuff in the chat. Can any of us download the chat and save it, or is it something?
It's actually there permanently. You can scroll back and see ones from previous meetings. You can save it yourself if there's something in there you particularly want to look at. And Paul was making his point there about the DRM issues.
Sorry,
Yeah,
how do you save
it's
it?
just something to be aware of, really, because we spent some time trying to hack the problem, and we realised it was a hardware issue. Perfectly compliant HDMI cable box and everything, but it just wasn't the latest version that the licensing people and the lawyers had decided was acceptable. And we spent quite a lot of time trying to problem solve that until we found out why it wasn't working. So if you are having problems doing stuff on your new installation that Peter's kindly talked us through, it's just one of the things to be aware of. One thing I was going to add, it strikes me that having a memory stick with a portable system like that is very, very handy if you're traveling. I know you can use a VPN, but that doesn't solve all your problems because it keeps you, if you're in hotels on dodgy Wi-Fi and stuff, or in dodgy countries, it keeps you more or less a lot more virus free, doesn't it? Because you're effectively running in RAM and scrapping it at the end.
Yeah, good point, Paul. There is an industry for these special purpose USB sticks. You mentioned one. Another one is a recovery stick. So you can get images which is designed to fix or recover your main disk. Particularly if Windows isn't booting up, you can boot up from a USB stick, which will have a Unix operating system, and then you can inspect your Windows system and try and fix a problem, or maybe just extract all the documents and images off it, ready for a reinstall. Yeah, good point. Anything else before we adjourn? As I said, next week we'll go for Ask the Group Anything. So think about things you want to ask the group. It could be on something we've talked about. It could be something that we haven't talked about, but let's try to keep it broadly in the computer science area.
Here's a problem that people might want to work on in the week. I don't know if anybody's cracked the capture thing yet. I still find them a little bit confusing. It says tick all the boxes that got a bicycle in. Now, do you include the cyclist's head that happens to just creep into another box? Or do you include a little bit of the mudguard that sticks out? And I don't know what the rules are that they're actually running, because I've tried all sorts of combinations. And on a lot of these bloody websites, I end up going through about 8 or 9 different things before I get it right. And I don't know if other people are having that problem, and if anybody's aware of what algorithm they're actually running as to what actually qualifies as the square you're supposed to tick. If it says cyclist, you include the bit of the person's peak visor on his hat because he's sitting on the bike. So somebody, people might want to have a think about that in the week.
These are these captures.
Yeah. I just spent, I think, about 10 minutes this morning trying to get through about
I thought it was just
these
me.
verifies.
I thought it was just me, but other people are telling me, and somebody somewhere might have a connection to somebody in Google or whatever that says, no, this is how we do it, but other lot do it this way. At least we'd know.
No, I think they're getting tougher because of I think they think you're a robot or whatever.
The way they work is the data, what box to click on, just comes from what other people have clicked on before. So it's not So it's not as though they've got the right answer. You
Oh, I
just
see.
agree with the majority of what's happened
Well,
before.
that explains everything. So if a bunch of us get together and click the blue sky each time, that
Yeah.
could really spanner it up for people
Yeah. So
trying to identify the fire hydrants.
yeah. So websites add these in because for some reason they don't trust you. And that could be from a number of different reasons. One reason I came across was I switched to a different ISP and I was allocated an IP address, and that IP address was previously used by some hackers. And so I got these on pretty much every website I went to. I had to click through until I changed to a different ISP, got a different IP address, and suddenly my IP address was more trusted by these websites.
Yeah, I've had other things where websites have said we've got unusual traffic, but they've detected somehow that I'm using a VPN. And iPlayer is bad actually, because even if I'm using a point of presence in the UK and it's coming out through a UK server, it still says you are using a VPN. We will not support this.
Yeah.
So there must be some way of telling that you're using a VPN, which isn't the way the VPN is supposed to work.
Companies like the BBC have gone through and collected all the IP addresses of the VPN servers.
That is
of
a
number of these
possibility, but
companies,
it is
and
a
they've got their
possibility.
own database now.
It's a
I've come
possibility,
across that before.
is it? Yeah, but if they're doing that, then they're supposed to cycle them round anyway.
You can get VPNs that do like dynamic address changes, but there's a lot of them that just have a fixed server that comes out in the UK or in the States or somewhere. And obviously it's very easy to collect those IP addresses and just say, VPN, put that in the database and just ignore it or exclude it.
Yeah.
Going back to that catcher, I've recently come across one that keeps asking me to move a jigsaw puzzle piece.
Yep.
And I have yet to actually achieve that. It's never worked at all. You're supposed to slide the jigsaw puzzle over the slot. Never got that to work. As luck happens, when you try it, it gives you another option of picking some characters or some images, and that always works. So I've got past that way. But that jigsaw puzzle thing seems to be a complete waste of time.
Well, I know we're slightly off topic, but the other one is where you get the I's and the L's and the ones, and you can't tell what they've used in that sort of graphic art they used.
Yes, agree completely. Yeah.
There is a new one I've seen recently. It was Microsoft, where you have to rotate something like a hammer round so it's pointing in the same direction as a plant is pointing, or something like that. And you rotate it round like 30 degrees at a time.
So this would have been a good subject for next meeting.
I thought I'd mention it now.
Perhaps the topic for this one. Anything else for today's topic?
You've got Peter there.
Go on, Pete.
Okay, just a quick one. I think when we had on the last topic, when we had all these funny characters come out and we couldn't read them, I was told they were using that way of getting some character recognition in some old scanned documents and they were using that process to i.e. a logging process or attaching process to get the document scanned for nothing or checked out for nothing. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Just out of interest, that was it.
All right, so let's leave today's meeting at that. So I'll see you next month for Ask the Group Anything.
Okay.
Within reason.
Thanks very much, Peter. Very interesting.
Yep. Thank you, Peter. Very useful.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Pete and everybody. Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you.